Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's CITRIS Research Exchange. I'm Brandy Noneke. I direct the CITRIS Policy Lab, where we support interdisciplinary tech policy research and engagement. This is actually the 13th year of the CITRIS Research Exchange Seminar Series and the 20th year of the CITRIS organization. We have hosted a remarkable lineup of technology innovators in person at Sara-Jayne Hall, and fingers crossed, hopefully again in person very soon. And we're glad to see all of you join virtually today for the Spring 2021 series. Before we begin the talk, I want to first highlight a few upcoming CITRIS events. The next CITRIS Research Exchange will be held on Wednesday, February 17th at 12 p.m. Pacific for a discussion on labor and automation in California agriculture, equity, productivity, and resilience with Tom Harmon, professor at UC Merced Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and director of the Sierra Nevada Research Institute. Registration for the Women in Tech Initiative at the University of California's flagship event is now open. In its 5th year, this major annual event will showcase issues, sector opportunities, and the career paths of experts in human-computer interaction. For virtual participation today, please post all of your questions in the Q&A box. You should see a Q&A icon in your Zoom toolbar. Clicking the thumbs up icon on a question will help bring it to the top of the Q&A window. Questions will be addressed at the end of the talk. To open up our talk today, I'm going to give an overview of what Sara-Jayne Terp is going to present. In just 4 years, disinformation has evolved to the point where it is now widely used by a spectrum of actors, from activists to nation states, and is difficult to counter with fixed methods. CogSec Collab and its predecessor, MisinfoSec, designs and tests real-time response to disinformation incidents. The Collab applies information security principles to defenses against disinformation, builds processes and tools for this, and runs or mentors response teams, including the CTI League's COVID-19 focused disinformation team. This talk covers recent research on disinformation risk management and cognitive security operations centers. Today, we are very excited to introduce Sara-Jayne Terp. Sara-Jayne works on social data problems, including community-based ways to track, counter, and mitigate disinformation. She leads the CogSec Collab disinformation community, runs the CTI League's disinformation team, and is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she writes about human issues as systems. She recently co-launched 3 Consulting. Her degrees are in AI and neural networks. It is my great honor to welcome Sara-Jayne.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's begin. So I'm going to talk about some of the recent work we've done on disinformation risk management, so disinformation as a risk, and how you create cognitive security operation centers. So this is continuation of work we've done on adapting information security principles, practices, and toolings to use against disinformation. So first thing, I'm not going to go through a whole bunch of disinformation examples because there's been a lot of practical examples recently. But just start by talking about the difference between disinformation and misinformation. So misinformation is false content. You're usually seeing this as false text messaging, or sometimes you see it as false images. It's not always deliberate. It might be part of a campaign. Disinformation on the other side is deliberate. It's a deliberate creation, a deliberate promotion of false information or misleading information or misattributed misinformation. The information carried can actually be true. I think the golden ratio is about 10% disinformation to 90% true information. And this is attacking belief systems, but also systems of emotion. It's being used to do things like increase fractures in society. And it's pretty prevalent right now. But these definitions, so we're really interested in large scale, we're interested in belief and emotion changes, And we're interested in, especially online, but not exclusively online, the creation, the propagation, the consumption of it. So we started, there were not that many organizations working on disinformation. Now there are hundreds. So this is a map we built off a data set that was built off a data set that we helped build in the first place. But it's online. So you can go and click on a country, see who's in that. And one of the things that we built the collab for was to help mentor organizations on how to join up their responses. So what we have at the moment is lots of organizations working independently. There are starting to be networks. We've seen networks around elections. We've seen networks around fact checking. But there was work to be done in how to rapidly share information about disinformation events and how to get, oh, sorry, finger trouble. How to connect up a joined up response to what's a joined up problem. So how do we do that? We looked at who was involved and who could be involved in responding. So again, when we started, people were looking at the problem, they weren't necessarily responding to it. So we listed out which types of community, which types of groups could do something about disinformation. And we listed out all the ways they could do things. The thing on the right, that's the ISAC system. So there's an existing set of organizations, connected organizations, who monitor for information security threats in their areas. For instance, food agriculture or financial services or dams. And they share information between organizations. And if it's already existing, we thought, why don't we build things that can carry disinformation, not just in the same way that they share information, but also be able to share in their systems too. So we've used the same technologies they do. And so we can just add disinformation into the list of things they monitor. This community-based stuff, a lot of stuff is on communities. So 10 years ago, several of us were involved in responding to large-scale natural disasters as part of the crisis mapping movement. So we were used to building systems of volunteer teams that were joined up around the world, rapidly responding. And today it's not so different. There are joined up teams responding around the world. And here are some of the ones we've been involved with. So last year on COVID, we were working with teams from TEDx. We were working with the CTI League, and we started off several other teams. So disinformation. So practical things we've done, because we need to talk about the practical things. The CogSec Collab itself has deployed 4 times in the last year. It only started last January, so it's been a little busy. A lot of the recent work has been on extremism. It also mentored and populated the lead teams for the CTI League. So the CTI League is a 1,000-strong information security response team looking for mitigating and responding to hacker and other InfoSec threats to the medical sector during COVID-19. They needed a disinformation team. We built that. We operate within the larger team connected to teams like the Darknet team. There's a report out tomorrow on that. So other things that we've done as part of that, trying to connect people, we needed to build the systems to connect them. And to do that, we needed to build the standards for the systems that connected them. So we've been working with people like NATO, the European Union, countries, and what is an ISAL for cognitive security, but is now becoming, the name is now, I think, the Cognitive Intelligence Center, and other teams working on things like games. Also the UN. The UN is building a set of units around the world. So again, we're all about communities, we're all about connections. Starting point for the work that we do. So we started by looking at cybersecurity processes, tools, and how we could adapt those to counter disinformation. We realized that the problem and the solution were both bigger. And as we dug, we realized that cognitive security, so the idea that for cybersecurity, you're working on networks of machines with the endpoints of the machines. For cognitive security, you're working on networks of humans, so communities of humans, where the endpoints are human brains. So we as we went through old material, realized that this idea that humans are part of security systems and can be modeled as part of security systems had been around for a very long time, but it needed calling out. So we started socializing the idea that there's cybersecurity. There was already physical security, so why break it electronically? Where could you just remove the machine? And now there's this layer of cognitive security on top. So when we say cognitive security, this is what we mean. And it covers more than just disinformation. One of the things we've encouraged people is to not call themselves a disinformation something, because the set of online harms and the set of threats that this correlation brings is much wider. So securing brains, securing networks of brains. Okay, so that's a little bit about the collab, a little bit about why we started working on cognitive security, and this is the recent work. So in the last few months, we've started formalizing the work that we've done with those teams. And what we realized was that we were building these things called security operation centers, almost accidentally. We built things that had parallel operations, similar ways of working. So I'm going to talk through some of these. So what we were doing in the CTI League was cyber threat intelligence. And the CTI League has these breakdowns of the things that it does. So you're informing, you're sharing information about ongoing incidents. You're very much a transmitter. If you can, you're neutralizing. So either you yourself are doing things like triage and takedown, but generally somebody else is able to respond. So you're escalating over to those. We worked a lot with law enforcement, so you can escalate to law enforcement, you can escalate to government, you can escalate to platforms. We worked with teams all over the world, so we had escalation across all over the world. You can work on preventing, and this is something I'm going to talk about in disinformation risk. So it's understanding what the vulnerabilities in the systems are. So very much information security focus, but it's thinking about what the vulnerabilities are, what the indicators that something has gone wrong are, and getting those out to organizations. For instance, some of the organizations we worked with were hospitals. If one hospital has an incident, it's worth telling the others this might happen to them too. Support. So again, this is upfront risk work, is working out how likely an organization is to be hit, how ways they can prepare ahead of time, and working as a clearinghouse. So collecting incident data, sharing that out with other organizations. So disinformation SOCs. I've said about some of the things we want to do, but how do you start organizing these too? So again, cybersecurity has a good answer. And if you look at existing SOCs, you find that what they do are these three main operations. So what most people think about is the day-to-day responses, instant response. So something has happened, you need to respond to that, you need to investigate, you need to take action. But there's also the enablement work, the foundational work you have to do before you can do that. You're dealing with very large data. And if you're sharing, you need those information frameworks. So you also need to run in training as well. And this is third part. And I've been talking a little bit about it as we go, but it's formalizing the idea that you're not just responding. You also need to do mitigation work to stop these things either happening in the first place or to mitigate if they do happen. And there are a whole bunch of different ways you can do this. We've been running red teams all year, and you can run simulations. You can have other people try to break into your systems. Again, there are disinformation equivalencies. There's also coming up, this isn't a big thing yet in disinformation, but it is in other parts of InfoSec, this idea of compliance. So there are regulations starting to come through. They've looking mostly at the platforms, but I would expect regulation to be wider. So how do you prove compliance to regulation? So this early upfront work, the mitigation work. And there are some issues with running these SOCs. One of these is the boundary problem. So you may be responsible for a small thing. So if in InfoSec, these three boundaries tend to line up on each other. The system that you are responsible for and control, the system that you are monitoring, and the system you can take action within. It's not the same for disinformation. In disinformation, you have the system that you control and are responsible for. Generally your platforms, generally your communities. But you have to monitor a bit further out. You need to monitor social media platforms. You need to monitor across internet domains. The actions you can take, generally you can take some actions within your own organization. You can take action within your own SOC, but you also need to involve things like the business units. You need to involve marketing, communications, sometimes the platform teams, and other organizations you're connected to, like the InfoSec and the Countermeasures SOCs. So one of the reasons for connecting to other organizations is this boundary issue. You need to connect because you can't respond on your own. So how do you put these things together? So there are different ways to build a CogSoc. I'm going to talk about the internals of it, but externally, you can see the large organizations, for example, the Cognitive Security ISAL, the intelligence centers that are dedicated to disinformation. They are just one big CogSoc, one big Cognitive Security Operations Center. They tend to connect to a lot of organizations, including the ISACs, ISALs. On the other end of the scale, on the bottom right of this diagram, you have a cognitive security desk. So it's a standalone team. It's not connected to information security, but it does need to talk to the internal legal, communications, platform, and trust and safety teams, because it's disinformation. You have that need to widen your monitoring and need to widen your control. The middle is the one that we think most organizations will do, which is they have an existing information security operations center. Add a desk to that. Again, a small team, but it's a small team embedded within the main InfoSec security operations center. So you're running one operation center, but again, it needs to be able to talk to the InfoSec SOC. So the InfoSec inspired and InfoSec frameworks, tools that we've built to be as close as possible to InfoSec SOC to carry through the same systems means that that's less of a squeezing in disinformation and hoping it works okay. A lot of this work is about avoiding the hope it works okay problem. And over on the left is what we think the larger organizations are likely to do, which is to keep their information SOC standalone, but to build a standalone cognitive security operations center, so CogSoc, that connects to it. So they talk to each other, still talking to legal comms, platforms, trust and safety, still talking to outside organizations. So there's a lot of work behind this on how do you make sure that's not a complete disaster. The pieces you need internally is the pieces you need for any system, people, culture, process, technology. And I've talked about this one before. So in here, really interesting bits you need to think of that are different with disinformation is you need good safety processes. You need both operational security so that you're not exposing yourself to things like viruses coming through unknown websites, but also mental health processes. This is difficult work. Even if you know what you're doing, even if you've been doing it for years, it can still be hard reading disinformation, hate speech, and related information all day. So making sure that that safety is good. Also timeliness. So you need enough people to be able to respond in time. And how do we put that one together? So this is an adaptation from the triage systems that standard stocks use. And just thinking about where the information comes in, where the information goes out. So tiering is a way of separating up the tasks that are done by a SOC. So tier one, information comes into tier one, and that's a quick triage. Is this relevant? Can we gather just some data to start off a ticket saying that we may need to look at this? Tier two is the deeper analysis. It's a team that are doing OSINT, so open source intelligence. They're looking at that first remediation. If you can do something, do the thing. So this is very much a tactical response. Things are happening, respond at that point. Tier four is the management layer. This is where you would sit with a crisis plan. So when the sticky stuff hits the rotating thing, there is a plan of how to respond to this. And that connects out to business, that connects out to responders and partners. Tier three. So most teams have tier one, might usually have tier two. Tier three is the much longer term work. This is the going and looking for threats. So threat hunting is going and looking for those risks so that you can then mitigate them. It's doing that deeper analysis. It's doing things like attribution analysis. So tier one tends to produce ticket systems, tickets in systems. Tier two, you start responding. Tier three, you're building these reports that you can then feed into your crisis plan and then decide what to do as an organization. And they're both, all of these tiers need access to disinformation knowledge. You're keeping running logs of known artifacts, known narratives, actors, segmentation of generally the audiences they're aiming at. And 2 and 3 tend to need specialist knowledge, political knowledge for an area, maybe industry, maybe the marketing. It's putting this together. So having talked through what a SOC is, how it starts fitting into existing systems and what it looks like on the inside, let's kind of look at some of the things it needs to enable. And this is the work that we've been doing for the last few years. So I'm just showing a few new bits on that. Layer models. So we need models to describe disinformation quickly. So one of these is talking about the pieces you would expect to see. And this is actually how we report. So in the middle, there are incidents. So an incident is generally a time-bounded event. So you will see, for instance, something around a real-world event like an election. You see something around a hashtag. You'll see an emergent set of narratives. Narratives, these are the stories that we tell ourselves. So they include identity narratives, like who we are, in-group and out-group narratives about who we do and we don't belong to, and also the world narratives of what's happening around us. Each of these can be used, can be attacked, can be put out as misinformation. And that tends to sit on artifacts. So artifacts are the things that you see. So as a data scientist, I see messages, images, videos, I see accounts, groups, connections between them. But you need to, as somebody defending, work your way up this pyramid. The person who's creating this, so campaigns are longer term work. So we think of things like the anti-vax movement as a long running campaign. You might see a campaign that has a series of incidents within it around an election too. So we think about, is this part of a longer term campaign? What the incident within it? So what are the incidents? we look at a specific instance, like one that's working at the moment. So we tend to work on the instance layer. What are the narratives within that? What are the artifacts underneath that? And if you start mapping these things, you can start looking for patterns. You can start looking for repeats. So one of the things we adapted, yeah, and there's some scary amount of pink on this, is the sticks object model. So the ISACs and the ISALs that I mentioned earlier, they have a sharing standard called sticks. And this talks about who are the threat actors. So I am losing my pointer, but never mind, no pointer. Who are the threat actors in this? What are the campaigns within them? What are the incidents they've created? So for this incident, so these pink boxes are the layers on that pyramid. Within an incident, what else is related to it? But also, what are the activities we see within this incident? So what are the techniques being used? So all of the blue ones are the creator techniques. The little green one is one that gets missed too much, and that's the response techniques. So we deliberately put these at the same level so we can start talking about how you create groupings of these. And down at the bottom of the artifacts, you have things like accounts, but you also have things like real humans and hashtags. There are lots of other things we can pick up. The narratives are off on their own because there are groups that track almost exclusively the narratives. But this is enough for us to describe and share. There are other models out there. Some of you will be aware of the actor behavior content models, the ABCs and the ABCDEs. And these are the pieces they cover. So the actor covers the threat actors, the behavior covers the threat actor behaviors, and the content covers those artifacts. And the middle layer, the behavior layer, we needed to create models for that. So one of the first things we created was this. This is Amit. And this is very similar, deliberately very similar to an InfoSec model called attack. And what you have are these 4 phases along the top. And underneath that, we have these tactic stages. So there were 12 stages. And the idea is that you can map out a incident and the work that a creator on an incident does, working at the left and working way over to the right. So within each of those, underneath each of those blue boxes, those stages, you have techniques. So these are specific techniques that we've seen used. And for each of those techniques, we then list description, example, and any counters that we've either seen or we believe will work against them. So we also include indicators. So what are the things you might see if one of these things starts happening? So there's, again, a fair bit of work around that. That's just one half of the box and no. So this is what the creator is doing. We also looked at ways you can respond. So we found 180 odd different ways that you could respond to the tactic stages and the techniques in Amit. And we split this up into groups. We detect, because at the time everyone was detecting. So we kind of went, okay, we'll do that. But also you have these other types of move. You can stop somebody getting into your system, a deny move. You can disrupt them. Once they've got in, you can interrupt what they're doing. You can slow them down. The deception is fun. You can honeypot for disinformation. You can destroy their ability to work. And lastly, for some of, especially the financially motivated, you can just deter them from the creators from doing this in the first place. So things, example, like removing the financial incentives for financially based disinformation. So we came up with a 12th stage for this too. So these are the same tactic stages. We're about to clean all of this up, but this is a first look at what a set of counter moves could be. And just to give an example of one of those, this is the reality team. and the reality team create counter narratives. So as we find narratives, as we find disinformation narratives, they create very simple counter narratives and put those into the spaces where disinformation is. They segment their audiences, they advertise out to those audiences. It seems to work. It seems to push the disinformation out. So one of the big issues with disinformation, again, it's with the cognitive security, not calling it disinformation, is that we have an information landscape, and disinformation is just one of the ways that that disinformation landscape could go wrong. For example, if people are looking for information in a space and that information isn't there, that's a very obvious place to put disinformation. So part of the work that needs to be done is not just removing disinformation, but it's also producing a better landscape of information so that there are less places for disinformation to get into. So this is one of the information moves. Instant response, so just looking at some of the things that happen. And a lot of this, we have the 3V problem. So volume, variety, velocity. So this is the big data 3Vs. And we've got a lot of information coming at us fast. It's not necessarily useful information, so we have to filter through. It comes across lots of different platforms. It comes in lots of different structures. So we need to combine that. We need to deal with that. One way you can deal with the volume velocity problems is to start to automate some of this. So we looked at which parts of those 4 phases, planning, preparation, execution, evaluation, could be automated. So red is, this isn't probably going to be automated at all, through to a deep green, which doesn't exist here, of we think we can automate a lot of this. So preparation, execution on both the attack and defense sides, and we think there's ability to automate. Planning side, not so much. Evaluation side, not so much either. Really, disinformation is unlikely to be fully automated. I expect it to be human in the loop. So automation helps the humans, doesn't necessarily replace them. So tactical tasks, the sort of things that we end up doing all day. Activity analysis, we're tracking artifacts. We're looking for where they came from. We're looking for related things. We're tracking them moving across channels, sometimes chasing right behind them. Looking for those AMIT techniques, looking for those behaviors. So typical ones are things like computational analysis, amplification, the narratives that moving. Also looking at networks. So tracking, looking at artifacts on their own. So looking at text on its own, or an article on its own, or an image on its own doesn't tell you that much. Again, remember that some disinformation campaigns use real information, true information. So you're tracking on the structure rather than the content. So network detection helps a lot. Looking for networks of all authentic websites, the pink slime networks. Looking for group networks, botnets, yes, but general account networks. And on the longer end of the scale, when you're looking at sites and articles, it's a credibility verification, it's fact checking, but also source checking. So labeling domains, labeling publishers, not just their articles. Again, they mix true articles with disinformation. So it's looking at the level that you do this work at. Machine learning AI helps with some of that. Graph, text analysis, image, video. Shared awareness. How do you share things? The system we've been working with, and AMIT is now part of, is the MISP system. So this has the ISAOs, ISACs, European Union, NATO, Fortune 500. So a lot of people use this. So we've added disinformation standards into it, both MISP and other standards. And yeah, lots of places to use. This is what an AMIT for the pandemic incident. There was a set of fake experts with a website, very beautifully reduced video. So this is the AMIT list for that. So look at this, see if there are ways to counter each of these as they happen. Do you have a left, right thing here? The further left you can go to stop an event, to stop an incident, the better. So we're looking at ways that you could detect before this gets to the general public. Risk mitigation, because I said I would talk about risk mitigation. So this is the very latest work that's been going on. There's a white paper out later this month, and just let's talk a little bit about what this means. So like other risk work, we've been adapting the risk mitigation work used in things like anti-piracy. So what are the events? Who's this happening to? What are the effects of these? How bad? How likely? And which environments is this happening? But also, can you change things in this environment? So which factors within this could you change to make this lower? And measurement. There's a bit of a problem with not having enough measurement of disinformation. So how do we measure these things? Mitigation and remediation. So which actions you use to balance out the risks, to balance out the values that you have, and to balance out your environmental factors within that. Again, measurement. But it's this idea that you predict ahead what the risks might be. You need to prioritize because you've usually got more than you can handle once you started listing them. And you need to start that earlier protection. So not just thinking disinformation happened, oh, what the hell do I do? But this risk-based framework way of thinking about it. And that's things like landscape, just looking at what's already out there. So what do you need to protect? Who you need to protect it from? What they could affect within that? What the vulnerabilities in your systems are? And what mitigation do you already have? That's lots of mapping. It's that threat actor, targets, attack surfaces, organization capabilities, but that stuff we've already done. This is just slower and thinking in terms of effects. So some of the things we have done in the past, all of last year, we ran red teams. So again, InfoSec idea. The blue team are the responders. Red team is where you take your team and they play act, being the people breaking into your systems. So we've done a bunch of different ones of these. Hostile social media platform. What would we need to do? We'd learn from each of these. We'd learn and then we start doing protections. We've mixed disinformation with some real stuff, like how do you spoof sensors and add that in? How do you extend? So we looked originally when COVID first started at the environment around COVID and things like anti-mask, but also what else do we expect to happen in medical safety as disinformation additives? We got ahead of a couple of them. Simulations and games, something that we've wanted to do for a long time is create games based on AMIT. We have the techniques lists, we have examples, we have counters. So what happens if you start putting up techniques, counters, techniques to counter those counters, and go across the AMIT stages with that. And Drug, the people behind the Bad News Game and Harmony Square, they've been doing that. They've been using that in our tech system, which is absolutely wonderful. And finally, and I think I'm a little early, so I will talk slowly or something. Just the enablement work again. So CogSec Collab is a community. CTI League is a community. They're both volunteer communities. And some of the things that they do are about sharing. CTI League is about sharing its abilities and experience and helping protect the world, the medical world better. CTI League is about other teams. So we share our trainings, we share our tools, and we've built things like the big book of how we run these things, how we do these things. So I am a little early, apologies, I talked too fast, but that's pretty much it on disinformation, security operation centers, and disinformation risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful about the different tactics that can be taken. We have a couple of questions, and I also have a set of questions here, but let me first look at the questions that have come in from the audience. So the first question I'll ask are, what are some examples of methods for achieving better information?
Well, there's a whole bunch of work, and luckily some of it's happening. For example, local news. There are networks of hundreds of sites that are pretending in America to be local newspapers. And it's really hard to tell. They carry biased information, disinformation, and in amongst local flyers. So one way to achieve better information is to build out a local news network to improve the availability of local news in smaller communities. So that's one thing. Another thing is to go where people are looking. I've liked the things that the big social media platforms have done with COVID. With when you look up COVID, you get a little tab saying, "Hey, this is information about," or "We're not sure about this." So the counter narratives are also good. You can pre-place a lot of those. It's gardening. You basically need to garden your ecosystem. The best people I know on for doing this is Wikipedia. They've done this for a very long time. So they're a good example.
Based off of that question, how would you guide a community in, kind of enabling them to be able to do some of this research? How could they investigate whether or not their local media is disinformation?
Well, most disinformation has a URL at some point, a domain name. So one thing they can do is they can look up on some of the larger URL lists of disinformation URLs, see if that domain is already listed. Another one is to look at the news. The Credibility Coalition has worked on indicators for publishers and news of, is this, do these have bylines, do these have dates, are these connected? You can look up phrases from stories because quite often they're repeated in other places. So you get syndicated disinformation. There are nutrition label groups who publish the equivalent of a nutrition label for publishing sites. Look there too.
That's really helpful. So somebody writes, I love the architecture and the model alignment with InfoSec practices, super valuable. You've already anticipated one key question. How are you thinking about measurement of threats and the impact of mitigation work? Anything from the pandemic campaign that was instructive about measurement?
Oh, that's that. If we knew the answer to that one, then we'd be doing really well. The same tools you can use for marketing apply to disinformation defense. So you can look at things like reach. You can look at things like spread. You can go and see if this narrative has made communities. If you've got money, you do surveys. But I think there is an open research field on measurement of disinformation, measurement of mitigation too. So I wish we knew the answer to that one. We're just starting in on that.
I have a few governance questions. I'll actually open up with mine first, and then I'll go to an audience governance question that I think will dovetail nicely with this question. You talked about regulation and compliance, and I'm wondering, what do you think appropriate regulation should look like? And then what entity should be in charge of oversight for compliance?
So the first thing is that the US government in particular doesn't have a joined up response. So there needs to be a organization that doesn't necessarily run all of the other pieces because disinformation turns up all over the place and lots of different government agencies get involved. But it does need some independence from them. So I think there is an argument for at least a coordinating body that connects them up. In terms of rich regulations, Section 230 needs an overhaul.
In what way?
think that I
I'm
knew you were going to ask that.
Because we have the what is it, the Safe Tech Act that came out this past week.
Yeah.
To reform.
Yeah, so
I'm curious what you think.
So my co-author Pablo is the person to talk to about Section 230, but the bottom line is you need a better definition of publisher. So if an organization is making most of its money from advertising revenue, they are by argument a publisher. So there's definitely, again, open research on sizing and response there. It was the second question, sorry.
What should be implemented?
Okay, one thing about disinformation is that disinformation and privacy are very strongly linked. Mm-hmm. Being able to target communities, being able to target people individually is a side effect of not having as strong privacy as you should, or not having as strong control of your privacy as you should. So I think better privacy regulations would help. You've got this triple interaction between disinformation, democracy, privacy, and it's securing one of those will help with the others.
Yeah, and I think another issue that you brought up in your presentation that works, ties very nicely to Section 230, this idea around privacy and micro-targeting is around the financial incentives. So there might be financial incentives for the spread of disinformation. We often think of that coming from the nefarious actors themselves, but I think we also need to be conscientious that the platforms themselves benefit from the spread of disinformation. It brings a lot of people to their platform. It keeps people engaged. We have this heuristic of kind of like, the head turn to look at the catastrophe. We're focused on the, the crazy stuff. So we have this tendency to go towards that content, and platforms know that. So they tend to feed up more extreme content in our feeds, and they can perfectly target a lie to those who are most susceptible. That might not have been the original intent of the recommender system algorithm, but these actors are fully aware and exploiting that vulnerability. So what do you think should be done around the business model of platforms?
Well, there are some things you can start talking about, is having transparency on those algorithms, because at the moment stuff turns up, you're not really sure how it got to you. Having the ability to turn off your advertising, again with privacy features. So what it knows about you, the fact that your tags are carried with you. So I am very tired of having to take out the large social media company IDs off anything I share, because they're automatically added. It's a combination of awareness and not just accepting that mechanism is how it should be.
Exactly. And then those for the audience too, the European Commission recently introduced the Digital Services Act, which I think is trying to target this issue around the recommender system, providing more transmit or a role for end users to be able to better understand how content is being fed to them, and then to be able to say, what, I don't want you to use these certain characteristics to feed me exactly what you think I want to see. I don't want my privacy invaded to that level. So there's definitely movement happening in the side of legislation. Regulation.
Well, that helps with other things. You've got things like black focused advertising, which can be absolutely execrable. So again, you fix one corner, it helps.
Exactly. So we have a related governance question now around the role of the organization itself, the private sector, and I would assume the platforms in this question. On governance, the architecture again makes a lot of sense from a management tier's perspective. Do you have, for example, public company boards are now really needing to center on cyber risk and ensure they are properly resourcing that risk management. I'm interested in which entity types have found they need to have the cognitive security risk in mind at the governance level.
So I think at the moment we're talking very, very large organizations the NATO's, the EU's, the governments, and it's not been as big a risk for large organizations as, unless they happen to be social media organizations, as the things like ransomware. Partly because ransomware is easy and is low risk to the people producing it. So this hasn't really been top of mind. The organization I've been working with on disinformation risk has been working with large tech organizations. So I think that's where it starts. I mentioned that there would probably be compliance. So I would expect this to trickle down, even if it's through regulation and compliance, but not enough yet. People have other things to worry about right now.
A lot. Another question around the model for attribution. So they say, finally, is the model for attribution likely to be similar for cognitive security attacks compared to other InfoSec work?
Yeah.
USDNI has released its framework, but has there been any development? Sorry, the questions are moving in the chat. As a development on multilateral, multi-stakeholder approaches that could serve to build attribution framework and potentially even roles for both cyber and cognitive security?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are big overlaps. So the disinformation team in CTI works with the darknet team, works with some of the work behind the scenes on this. And the mechanisms are similar, but you have similar problems with countries spoofing, pretending to be other countries and other teams. But attribution is always probabilistic at best. You have your best guess that this is. So there are organizations that do this well already. People like Graphica do it well. So yeah, yes, I think totally it's very, very similar.
That's helpful. I think a really interesting question about like who's targeted with disinformation attacks. We often focus on social media and publishing, but do you ever see disinformation attacks targeting other companies like airlines or Pepsi or Coca-Cola?
Weirdly enough, telecommunications companies. So there's a well-known example of Korean and Myanmar companies, one of which attacked another one with disinformation, a disinformation campaign. But there's also a secondary effect on companies. So for instance, telecoms companies get caught up by disinformation attacks. So British Telecoms in the UK, the BT, had several of its 5G repeaters damaged because there was a conspiracy, a disinformation campaign around 5G. Several of its people were attacked. So secondaries, more at the moment, but probably going to see more primaries. There are disinformation as a service companies emerging. They're going to look for things to do.
I'd love to hear more about these companies. I mean, obviously there's a business incentive for these to thrive. Can you talk more about these DISINFO as a service?
Oh, DISINFO as a service. So what we have is either organizations where people have done disinformation for a country or larger organization, or more you get things like marketing or spam organizations that are pivoting to disinformation as a moneymaker. So they're all over the world. There's Philippines, Indonesia. There've been examples in the US, but it's money making. There are so many different ways to make money from disinformation, and this is just one of them.
Yeah, and it seems like there's sort of an arms race between those who are creating these campaigns and then these entities that are popping up to try to mitigate them and identify them. Who's winning? Who's outpacing the other? Do you think that the identification of disinformation and these tactics, it's effective in keeping pace? And if not, what can we do?
I think this is a systems problem. If you think of it in terms of disinformation came this way, oh my God, we can't stop all the disinformation. You need to make the system safer, not the individual entity safer. So we can do everything across that AMIT graph, from disincentivizing the people who create disinformation through to making a population more resilient by training them. And in the middle, the platforms have done a fair bit of work recently on removing disinformation creators. So there's many, I mean, we have got 160 something ways you can do this and respond. The most important thing, I think, though, is to coordinate, is just joining up all these different responses, groups, ideas, and patterning. So I'm working on a country with the UN. There are patterns in other countries that can be used to help make their response faster.
I'm wondering, you know, when you're sourcing disinformation, when you're trying to identify where it's occurring, and if you're especially sourcing that from the public, can that process be gamed? And have you seen it be gamed? For some entities to try to say, oh, this is just disinformation, don't pay attention to it, even though it might be truth, or it might be, yeah, and the most catastrophic would be, is, you know, if it's something that's true and people are saying, no, it's a lie.
Oh yeah, reporting is being gamed, of course. And that's, you know, you analyze the stuff coming in. So every system can get gamed. It's just looking at why people would want to do that. Half our work is, you know, we're lucky it hasn't happened. risk mitigation is, the rest is thinking ahead and just putting pieces in place ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, good. It's helpful. We have a question come in here. Does your concept of disinformation and cognitive attacks include efforts that cause people to lose trust in the communications channel?
Oh, absolutely. So we talk about attacks on the system. So it's not just making people believe a different thing about the world. It's also making believe a different thing about the structure they're within. And one of the big structures is democracies. So Bruce Schneier has written a lot, has done some really good work on how disinformation can be used to reduce the trust in democracies, political organizations, the whole structures of government. So yes, very much so.
How can we rebuild trust in these institutions? I think people are more aware of the spread of disinformation, fake news, and it almost reaches this point where if you don't know that there's a definitive truth, then everything is a lie. And
conspiracy
is extremely detrimental to society, right? So how do we take back that power and help people become conscientious consumers of media while also, you know, not undermining all trust?
Well, one of the big things that happens is this fracturing of society. So one of the things you can start doing is rebuilding the connections across those societies. The Commons Project does this really well. They're using peace technology. So work that was done trying to rebuild communities fractured by war. And you can do this with disinformation response and disinformation remediation too. In terms of trust in democracy and entities within democracy, that's, again, a combination of just taking the straight path, truth-telling, and slowly rebuilding trust. There are better researchers than me for that, for how you rebuild democracies.
Right. Back to your point that we all need to be working together. You need a coordinated effort to deal with this issue. But Sara-Jayne, thank you so much for today's presentation. I learned a great deal from you. And thank you all for attending today's presentation.
Thank you.